I still remember the way the sunlight streamed through my bedroom window that afternoon, painting soft golden patterns on the floor. I was curled up in bed, reading, lost in a world that felt much simpler than my own. My name is Emily. I'm 22, a few years out of college, living at home again for a while after a job layoff. Life hadn't gone as planned, but I'd found a kind of peace in the quiet routine of our family house. My younger brother, Josh, was 17, sensitive, thoughtful, always a little more introspective than other boys his age. We had always been close in that way siblings sometimes are when their personalities quietly complement one another. I was the calm to his storm of self-doubt, the voice he trusted when he didn't understand the world around him. But lately, I'd noticed a shadow in his eyes. He wasn't sleeping well. He avoided his friends. And when I tried to talk to him, he'd smile too quickly, shrug too fast, as if he were holding something in that he didn't know how to release. That afternoon, he knocked on my door. "Hey," he said quietly, pushing it open an inch. I looked up from my book and smiled. "Hey you, what's up?" He stepped in slowly, hesitating at the edge of the room like it was unfamiliar territory. That wasn't like him. He usually sprawled across my beanbag chair or helped himself to my snacks without a second thought. "Can I talk to you?" Something in his voice made me sit up straighter. "Of course," I said, setting the book aside. "Come in." He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. For a long time, he said nothing, just stared at the floor, breathing in a rhythm I could tell he was trying to control. "Josh," I said gently, "whatever it is, it's okay." He looked up at me then, his eyes glassy, with something raw. "I think I might be not normal," he said, the words barely audible. I don't know. Lately I've been feeling off, different. My heart ached at the fear in his voice. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard. "I think I might be gay. Or maybe not. I don't know. I don't feel the same way other guys at school do. They talk about girls all the time and I don't know what I feel. Sometimes I think about both. Sometimes none. I'm scared." There it was. The question he hadn't known how to ask. The concern that had been eating at him from the inside out. I didn't speak right away. I just pulled him into a hug and let him rest his head on my shoulder like he used to when we were kids, and he had nightmares. His body trembled slightly. "Josh," I whispered, "nothing about you is wrong. You're figuring yourself out. That doesn't make you broken. It makes you human." He clung to me a moment longer, then pulled back, wiping at his eyes with his sleeve. I didn't know who else to tell. "I'm glad you told me," I said. "And if you want, I can help. Not to label you, not to push you, just to help you explore whatever you're feeling. Together." His eyes searched mine for something, for reassurance, for understanding. And I gave it freely. That night changed something between us. A quiet understanding began to bloom. The kind that doesn't come with easy answers, but with a promise that he wasn't alone. And neither was I. After that night, things changed between us, not in a dramatic, movie scene kind of way, but in 100 smaller, quieter moments. Josh started coming to me more often. Not just for serious talks, but for little things too, questions about books, music recommendations, or just to sit nearby while I worked on my laptop. He seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted just by speaking his fear out loud. And I became curious. Not in a judgmental way, not even consciously at first, but there was a part of me, deep down, quiet and observant, that wanted to understand him better. I found myself watching him when he wasn't looking, wondering what he saw when he looked at the world and maybe what he saw when he looked at me. One evening, a few days after his confession, I decided to test something. Just a nudge. A quiet way to feel the shape of this new space between us. I slipped into a fitted tank top and a pair of shorts that clung just right. I didn't overdo it, just enough to see if he noticed. If his eyes would shift. If he'd hesitate. He was on the couch, scrolling on his phone when I walked into the room. I moved casually, pretending not to notice him as I crossed the living room. When I leaned down to pick up a book I had accidentally left on the floor, I felt the tension in the air like a thread pulled taut. I lingered a second longer than necessary. When I turned around, he quickly looked away from me. That was all I needed to know. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel guilty. What I felt was something stranger, an understanding beginning to form, unspoken but powerful. Josh's world wasn't black and white. It wasn't even gray. It was shifting, alive, uncertain. Later that night, we were in the kitchen. I was making tea, and he sat on the counter, watching me. His gaze lingered longer now, like he was still trying to figure something out about me. Or maybe himself. "Do you think people can just feel close to someone no matter what?" he asked suddenly. I turned, meeting his eyes. "Yes. I think the heart doesn't care much about categories." He nodded slowly, absorbing my words. "That makes me feel a little less messed up." "You're not messed up, Josh. You're just becoming." He didn't answer, but the silence that followed felt charged, like something was beginning to hum between us. Not dangerous. Not yet. But real. From that night on, our closeness became something I couldn't ignore. We started cooking together, watching movies sprawled on the same couch, sometimes with his head resting against my shoulder. Once his hand brushed mine and he didn't move it away. I should have. But I didn't. I told myself I was just being there for him. That closeness didn't have to mean confusion. But late at night, lying awake in the dark, I started to wonder, was I helping him discover who he was? Or was I quietly, gently, becoming part of that discovery? It became a game, though I never would have admitted it to myself at the time. I began to experiment, softly, subtly, on the edges of our routine. I would linger a little longer in the hallway when I passed him, brushing against his arm. I'd sit on the armrest of the couch when he was already there, close enough that our knees would touch. When I dressed in the morning, I began choosing clothes with a new kind of awareness. Tank tops, shorts that hugged in the right places, cardigans that slipped from my shoulder just enough to suggest carelessness. At first, Josh tried not to notice. I could see it in the way he'd tense when I entered the room, the way his eyes would flick toward me and then quickly away, as if he was afraid to look for too long. But with each passing day, he got a little slower to look away. One evening, I called him into my room. My closet door was open, clothes scattered across the bed. "Hey," I said as he stepped in, eyes curious. "I need a second opinion." He raised an eyebrow. "On what?" I held up two outfits, both casual, both flattering in their own way. One was a sundress, short and soft, clinging gently at the waist. The other was jeans and a crop top, the hem riding just above my ribs. "I'm meeting a friend tomorrow," I said, though I hadn't made any such plans. "Which one looks better?" He hesitated, his eyes scanning each one. Then, before he could answer, I turned and slowly slipped into the dress, pretending to fuss with the straps. His reflection in the mirror caught my eye, rigid, alert, uncertain. I turned to face him, smoothing the fabric over my hips. "Well," he looked at me for a long time before answering. "The dress," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "It suits you." I smiled softly. "Thanks." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "You're, looking different lately." My heart skipped. "Different how?" I asked, pretending innocence. He didn't turn back. "I don't know. Just different." The door closed gently behind him. That night, I found him sitting alone in the backyard, legs curled under him on the old swing bench. The moonlight carved shadows across his face. He looked thoughtful, distant. I walked out barefoot, the grass cool under my feet. I sat beside him, without saying a word. For a while, we just stared at the sky, the silence between us full and quiet. Then he asked, "Do you ever feel like you're being tested?" I glanced at him. "What kind of test?" "Like, life is putting things in front of you to see what you'll do, what you'll feel." My throat tightened. "Sometimes." He nodded slowly. "I feel like I'm failing mine." I placed a hand on his arm, gently. "You're not failing, Josh. You're just learning, discovering. It's okay to be unsure." He looked at me then, and there was something fragile in his expression, vulnerability woven into confusion. "I don't know what I feel," he whispered. "Then let yourself feel without labeling it," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "You don't have to decide anything yet." That night, he didn't retreat to his room right away. Instead, we sat on the couch together, watching a movie we barely paid attention to. At some point, he rested his head on my shoulder, and I didn't move. My fingers found his hand resting on his lap, and without thinking, I let mine brush against it, just once. He didn't pull away. We stayed like that on the couch, pressed close, silent except for the soft hum of the television. The light flickered across the room, but we weren't really watching. It was one of those moments when everything else fades, and the only thing left is the quiet rhythm of another person's breath. Josh hadn't moved since resting his head on my shoulder. I could feel the tension in him, the way his body tried to stay still even as something inside him stirred. I don't know what pushed me to do it, what strange current of curiosity or comfort pulled me closer, but my hand moved, not slowly, not deliberately, just naturally, resting gently on his leg. I didn't grip, didn't press, just placed. He tensed. Not in fear, not in rejection. More like someone startled by their own heartbeat. I kept my gaze on the screen, though I didn't see it at all. My fingers didn't move, not yet. I was only listening, to his breath, to the silence, to the way the air between us was shifting. Then I turned to him, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you still think you're gay?" He hesitated. I could feel his body go still, the kind of stillness that only comes when someone is caught completely between thoughts and instincts. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "No." His voice broke on that one word. It wasn't shame or certainty. It was something raw. A truth not fully understood but felt. And before I could second-guess myself, before either of us could unravel what had just been said, I leaned in. My lips didn't touch his mouth. That wasn't the moment. Instead, I pressed them to the soft skin just beneath his ear, letting the warmth of my breath linger as I whispered, "It's okay. You don't have to be anything for anyone but yourself." He trembled slightly, and I realized he wasn't the only one holding tension inside. My heart was pounding too, fast and uncertain, as if I'd stepped out onto a frozen lake and heard the faintest crack beneath me. But I didn't move. He didn't either. There was something in that moment that wasn't about titles or explanations. It was about trust. About something being discovered not through answers, but through the courage to stay in the question. His hand, still beneath mine, turned slightly, enough that his fingers brushed mine in return. A silent acknowledgement. A pulse of connection neither of us had planned. We didn't speak after that. We just stayed there, in that quiet house, with only the flicker of the television and the sound of our breath tethering us to the moment. Something had shifted, and we both knew it. It was late, a soft, blue-tinted kind of late when the world feels hushed and distant. I was in bed, half lost in thought, letting the hum of summer insects outside lull me into a soft daze, when I heard the knock. It was light, almost unsure. "Come in," I called. The door creaked open, and Josh stepped inside holding a book in his hand. His hair was tousled, like he'd been rolling around in bed trying to sleep, but couldn't. He wore one of those worn-out t-shirts he loved, and a look on his face I couldn't quite read, something between nervous and excited. "I found this," he said, holding up the book. "Thought it might be interesting." He walked over and showed me the cover. The title was intimate, poetic, Naked Honesty, Stories of Wanting. My eyebrows lifted slightly. It wasn't something you'd expect to find on a shelf. "Where'd you get this?" I asked, taking the book from him, pretending to be casual. "Library. Hidden behind a bunch of old poetry collections," he said, smiling sheepishly. I read the first page. "It's different, but I liked it." Then, more quietly, "Can we read it together?" I nodded and lifted the blanket. "Get in." He lay down beside me, close but not touching. The bed creaked slightly under our combined weight. For a moment, there was only the sound of the pages rustling as I opened the book to the beginning. I started reading. The first story was about two strangers who discovered something about themselves through unspoken glances and soft touches. It was written in a slow, evocative rhythm, every word soaked in emotional weight, every sentence like a quiet confession. And as I read aloud, I leaned into the cadence. I let the syllables melt like honey, shaping each phrase with care. My voice dropped slightly, turning more breathy, more deliberate. I could feel him watching me. I didn't have to look to know. I turned another page, continuing, letting the intimacy of the text blur with the closeness of our bodies. At one point, I paused, glanced over. His eyes were wide, locked on me like I was the only thing in the world. There was a flush in his cheeks, and his breathing had gone shallow. "You okay?" I whispered. He nodded, just barely. "You sound amazing." A slow, quiet silence passed between us, not heavy, but thick with things unspoken. And then, with no ceremony at all, I leaned in and kissed him. His lips met mine as though they'd been waiting. Soft at first, unsure. Then deeper. I felt his hand slide to my waist, pulling me closer. Not in a rush, but in a need that had been growing for days. We moved slowly, like the book in my lap had cast a spell over us. Every gesture, every breath felt sacred. My hand cupped his cheek. His fingers tangled in mine. He looked into my eyes as if asking permission to feel this much. And I gave it. We stayed like that, curled together, the book forgotten somewhere in the blankets. Until the door burst open. A voice rang out. "Hey, have you guys seen?" Frozen. Breathless. My heart slammed in my chest. We jerked apart, startled. The air, which had been electric just moments before, now crackled with panic and silence. The figure in the doorway stood still, eyes wide. Then, "Oh," they said. Just that. A single word. And then they stepped back, closing the door with the quiet click of someone who had seen far more than they meant to. Josh looked at me, stunned. "What do we do?" I didn't answer. I just listened to the silence that followed, and wondered if anything could ever go back to the way it was before. We didn't speak for a long time after the door closed. The room felt smaller somehow, not because of the space, but because everything had changed in an instant. The air, once thick with quiet intimacy, now pressed down on us with the weight of reality. Josh sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around his waist like a shield. I mirrored him, careful not to look at him too directly, afraid that if I did, the unspoken thing that had been growing between us would feel too raw, too exposed. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. "I think it was Dad, maybe." Josh swallowed hard, running his hand through his hair. "Do you think he saw everything?" I didn't need to answer. The way the door had opened, the pause, the tone of that single, "Oh," it said enough. We were caught. "I should go," Josh said, swinging his legs off the bed, but I stopped him, gently catching his hand.
"No, don't."
"Not yet." He sat back down, and for a moment we just sat there, side by side in the dim light, listening to the distant hum of the house. "What are we going to say?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I bit my lip, staring at the book still lying open, its pages soft with meaning. We could say we were reading, that it was a story that got too real. "That won't work," he said, exhaling shakily. "They saw more than that." A pause. "Maybe we should say we were just confused." He glanced at me, searching my face. "Are you confused?" I hesitated. "No," I said finally. "Not about how I feel. But I don't know how to explain it." His shoulders slumped. "Neither do I." The idea of facing our parents, of explaining what we couldn't even explain to ourselves, was terrifying. Not because I thought they would yell or rage, but because of what it would mean. For our family.
For him. For me.
"We didn't do anything wrong," I said softly, as much to reassure myself as him. "But we crossed a line. One we can't uncross." "Do you regret it?" he asked. I looked at him then, truly looked. At his eyes, searching for safety. at his hands, still trembling slightly, at the boy who had come to me lost and questioning, and the young man now sitting beside me, still unsure but no longer alone. "No," I whispered. "I don't regret you." He reached for my hand again, and this time I let our fingers link completely. "Then maybe that's what we say," he murmured. "We tell them the truth. That we care about each other. That this didn't happen out of nowhere. They won't understand." "Maybe not," he said, squeezing my hand. "But maybe they'll believe we didn't mean to fall this close." The thought hung in the air like a prayer neither of us was sure would be answered. The next morning would come. Questions would be asked. Doors might close. But for now, in that small space between fear and honesty, we had each other. And the truth, as terrifying as it was, had already begun to write itself.